I did want to ask you about different diets. So on the one hand, our diet must obviously impact our metabolic health and things like microbiome composition. On the other hand, dieting is a very frustrating and annoying topic to a scientist, I think, and to a lot of people, because every week there's a new diet book out that claims to be the best diet for whatever, and a lot of it is clearly garbage mixed in with partial truth, mixed in with actual factual statements. So it's very difficult, even for an educated person, to make heads or tails of the whole dieting industry and what they can follow good advice for. So can you talk a little bit about a couple different popular areas of dieting and whether or not there's any clear evidence that they impact things like the microbiome? The one I want to ask you about first, because it's related to the stories you were telling us from your mountaineering adventures, is intermittent fasting. So it started to sound like you were saying that the body can sort of switch modes or regimes of metabolism and be less anchored in the hedonic signals that we're getting in the modern world and go back to mostly paying attention to homeostatic hunger signals if you just sort of remove yourself from having food all over the place. So does that tie into intermittent fasting and whether or not that can actually have benefits on our health?
Yeah, so, intermittent fasting has received a lot of attention recently. I personally like to sort of break this up into the truly intermittent fasting and the time-restricted eating, because I think is a significant difference between those two. So with time-restricted eating, which is a technique that I think is practical, is realistic. Almost everybody can do this, where you don't limit the amount of food that you eat, but you compress the feeding time, the eating time, into 8 hours or less if you can, and leave the gut empty for 16 hours. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of theoretical and preclinical reasons or evidence to support that. So one is, if you go to let's say you 16 hours of non-eating, a big portion of that happens during your sleep. So at least half of that happens during your sleep. And so you switch the whole physiology of your GI tract. You switch the contraction patterns from one of peristalsis and mixing and grinding to a regular, almost like clockwork sequence that every 90 minutes you have a big contractile wave starting in the esophagus, going all the way down to the end of your intestine. And that wave used to be called the housekeeper of the gut. We didn't really know when this first was detected. This was like when I started my career in this field, that this was first reported by investigators at the Mayo Clinic. So it was thought to clean the GI tract of all debris and undigestible food, but that's probably not the main function of it. If you imagine the microbes living in these different communities all along the gut, it puts them back into the right place, and it regulates the abundance in different parts of the gut. Like in the small intestine, you want to have a very low concentration of these microbes in the proximal small intestine, and a little bit higher in the distal and highest in the colon. So what this wave does, it puts everybody back into place. It's almost like cleaning up at the end of a busy day, in a restaurant. That seems to be a very important part of regulating the ecosystem. And there's different parts. These ecosystems are regionally specialized. You don't have the same ecosystem all the way through your gut. Mm-hmm. It's different in the small intestine, distal, small intestine, large intestine. So that's one thing. It also, this wave affects the secretion, affects blood flow, but it also has been shown now to affect the what's called the geography of the microbes towards your your gut lining and the cells that make up your gut lining and the immune cells. So during the fasting, you have a greater distance. So there's less of that signaling that goes from the microbes to the rest of the body. Then, during the feeding time. So both in terms of the ecosystem localization, relative abundances, and the geography of the microbes in relationship to your gut lining is altered during this non-eating phase. And we have almost abandoned this in our modern lifestyle, snacking in front of the TV till midnight or after midnight, and then having snacking throughout the day. The whole food bar industry is essentially a way of eliminating that mechanism, that regulatory mechanism from because the minute you put something in your mouth, it will stop that cleaning process. So this is, and I would say, there's very convincing mouse experiments that mice could be fed a very unhealthy, what's called cafeteria diet, on which they would gain weight and develop metabolic disturbances. If they are fed ad libitum, they can have access to the food all the time. But when they're switched to this time-restricted eating, they can consume the same diet, but will not show these negative consequences. So I think it's something, so we've tried this in our own family during the pandemic, during the stay-home phase. It's something that takes some discipline, not to, snack or have your glass of wine in the evening after dinner. But after a while, it sort of becomes a pretty natural state. And it definitely on our self-experiment has shown, beneficial effects on pretty significant loss of weight. Now, there are several studies out now. There's a lot of studies in animals, which are all positive. So a few studies out in humans, some of which are positive, others are negative, did not show a benefit. So the final word on that is still out. So this is all about time-restricted eating. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go to intermittent fasting, obviously a much more difficult thing to do for the average person, unless you're spiritually motivated or have a very high discipline.
So would this be intermittent fasting? Would that be having multiple days where you're not eating in a row?
Yeah, and people have used different patterns. So some people go on 1 week fasts or just water during a 1 week fast, or some go on 2 days a week, 1 day a week, one fasting day. I just think, being at work, like most people are, it's just like you can do this for the length of a clinical trial for a 4-week period, but there's evidence that many of these techniques, if you look at them after a year, will not be sustained, and obviously you lose. Then it's particularly bad because people lose weight on these dietary interventions. Then if you stop it, many have this yo-yo effect where then the weight increases above your baseline weight even. So you make things even worse. So, but I think, if you have the discipline, if you live a monastic life, the fasting is very, very important thing because it does affect the brain and your mind and consciousness. But for the average person, I just don't think that these techniques are realistic.
What do people tend to report if they go on a multi-day fast? I've heard that usually the first day or two, you basically get very irritable and you're probably not fun to be around. But then after that, you have other kinds of mental and behavioral changes.
Yeah, so people say that, they feel better, they have more energy, they've lost their brain fog, improved their concentration, so many positive things. And, that could be attributed. So what happens during this fasting is that you switch your main metabolic mode to a state of ketosis. So you're burning ketone bodies instead of sugar for your energy, and ketone bodies, from your fat stores. And so typically, when people go on a ketogenic diet, they actually eat or try to live primarily on animal products, fat and protein. But fasting essentially forces the body to do something very similar, without ingesting unhealthy aspects of a diet, which I think most of these animals, particularly if you consume them in high amounts. So if you look at it this way, and this is just really from self-experimentation, I have to say, I haven't seen the study. So if you go into intermittent fasting during that 16-hour not having food in your stomach, and particularly if you exercise, you get up in the morning, you exercise on empty stomach, you will have a certain degree of ketosis and burning ketone bodies instead of sugar, because there's no, ingested carbohydrates that you can burn. So if you extend that period by having your first meal of the day, which is typically at 11 or noon, being of plant-based fats and protein, without carbs. So these would be seeds and this would be mainly seeds, different types of seeds, and then you can actually expand that time of ketosis. So this is what we have switched to. So we are actually on a ketogenic mode for more than the 16 hours. We're probably on that mode for 20 hours a day. And again, we've not done a study on this. I've never seen a study on this, but from what I know, I would imagine that this is for the best way that you can use this ketosis principle for your own health without, at the same time, eating a healthy diet. Because your second big meal should be a highly varied plant-based diet with multiple fiber providing vegetables and fruit. So for me personally, I'm against the ketogenic diet for many reasons, environmental, but also health-wise. But I think utilizing that principle of a switching to a ketogenic mode during this not intermittent fasting, the time-restricted eating is probably a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So just to summarize, intermittent fasting, much harder to implement just because it's not as practical. You have to go multiple days without eating. But what you're effectively doing with intermittent fasting is putting your body into a state of ketosis, which is the same thing that people achieve when they go on this ketogenic diet that's high in animal fat and protein.
Yeah.
And the difference between that and the time-restricted feeding is that if you're doing time-restricted feeding, you just have to pick a start time and a stop time every day and stick to it, 16 hours without food. But it sounded like it really has to be 16 hours without anything except water, not even like a glass of wine or a glass of juice. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and that's the hard part. It's not, most people have their dinner, by 7, 8 at the latest, and they don't really feel like they want to have another meal. But the snacking and alcohol, that's the hardest part so you essentially change your lifestyle, and we have sort of come up with this idea that you don't have to do this 100%, because if you travel, if you go to a Mediterranean country or to Argentina, mm-hmm. you don't want to live like that for these 2 weeks that you're traveling there, because you're missing out on the best part of their culture, mm-hmm. Eating outdoor restaurants at 11 at night. But at home, related, you can easily build this into your work schedule. It's something it's something feasible without making a religion. We also found, when we invite friends over, obviously you don't say after 8:00 there's not a glass of wine or a glass of beer. So you don't have to be religious about this. You should be religious for most of the time, but don't sacrifice your social life or your enjoyment of other things because of that.